Extra Kart Part friends. That's Walter in the background sneezing, but I'm tired of doing edits. So, everyone say hi to Walter. So, on this video here, what to look for before doing an alignment on your chassis. What we have in front of us here is currently a FA, Fernando Alonso chassis, built by OTK. So, that's what we're going to work with. And this is in the shop for an alignment, but what are you going to be looking for? So, number one, you're looking for anything bent. So this might be a little bit difficult to see, but let's see here. You see how that steering shaft, this is the steering shaft for those who don't know. Steering shaft, the tie rods here connect to the steering shaft and to the spindles. This is the spindle. So what to look for? As you can see, this steering shaft is bent. And that's actually a pretty significant bend because that's going to change your geometry as you turn the wheel. So before we waste time and money aligning this kart, we're going to have to change the steering shaft. You want to know why the steering shaft bent. So a lot of times what happens is you hit a wall, you run over a cart, someone runs into you. Whatever excuse you have on why something got bent, whatever, I don't care. Mechanically, something bent the steering shaft. In some cases, it could just be the sheer force of somebody holding on the steering wheel hard enough, and the softest thing to give is the steering shaft. Some cases, not usually. So usually what happens is a tie rod, the wheel gets whipped out of your hand, the tie rod comes around, and as you can see, the tie rod will connect with the steering shaft right there, and it'll bend. And in this situation, I believe that's exactly what happened, because there's a little bit of a damage on the tie rod right here, a little bit. But when you look at the way the steering shaft is bent, it is bent kind of in the same rotation as if the tie rod would have hit and bent it. So again, we're going to change this steering shaft. While you're in there, you're going to inspect the uniball, which I'll get to in a different video. But there's a ball bearing inside the frame. You don't want any wiggle. You want minimal up and down slop, but you don't want any forward and back slop. So we're going to inspect that uniball. We're going to inspect the tie rods. So these tie rods are aluminum on most of these karts. So what we're going to be looking for is if you're at the track and there's a slight bend and it's not on the Heim joint itself, you can do a thrash job at the track. But if you're in a shop environment and the Heim joint is bent, depending on where you buy them, I buy the good ones. They're about 20 bucks each. The steering is very important, so you don't lose your steering. It's a safety issue. I am going to replace the Heim joints if they're bent in the threaded area. I'm just not even going to question it. I'm going to replace them. That's just part of shop work. But if you're at a track and you're thrashing and you need to get back on track, if it is bent in the threaded area, be very careful, really lean into it to make sure it's not going to snap if you go back on track. You can realign the kart with all these parts bent as long as your measurements, whether you're using toe plates or lasers, are correct. So, with the exception of the steering shaft, what happens is if it's bent, when you turn right versus left, you're going to have two different sets of geometry. So if you're in a bind, it's fine. Main event, you're thrashing, you're trying to get back out there, whatever. But again, in a shop environment, we're going to do it correctly. So what we are looking for, inspect the tie rods, inspect the Heim joints, inspect the bolts. Before you start taking anything apart, if you have a bad memory, you're probably watching this video from a phone. This phone probably has a camera. Take a picture of everything, because it is very important that you have the tie rods going back into the right locations, assuming the kart was properly set up to begin with. So you don't want to start messing with your Ackerman by moving the tie rod bolts to different positions, because then the kart's going to handle completely different. So take a picture. If your memory is about 13 seconds long or you're all ADD out, take a picture. You want the bolts to go back in the same spot. On this particular OTK, there is only one position for the tie rod, but on other chassis, let's see, give me a moment here. You'll see, like on this CRG spindle, there's two positions. Oh, I actually even grabbed the right side and everything. Impressive. You'll see two positions. Take a picture, make a note, write it down. Draw a drawing. I don't care how you do it, but it is important. So you're going to take pictures. You're going to write notes of where everything is located. If nothing is bent, when you check your alignment, write the notes down. And always do your alignment. Always, if you're using lasers, I don't care if your lasers are 13 feet off the spindle or right on here, depending on the style that you have. I don't care. Always make sure you do it the exact same way every time. Because if you're moving your lasers in and out, you could affect the reading on the other side. So always be consistent with when you're reading it. My particular snipers mount to the actual shaft of the spindle. So I have a specific setting I always use where I put them. So there's just something to think about. So back to the alignment. Spacers are important. So you want to look at spacers, the tie rod stuff there. Make sure everything's lined up. You want to look for any up and down slop. Maybe the guy before you didn't know what he was doing, and spacers are missing or they're wrong, or they're only using a smaller bolt, whatever it might be. The other thing you want to look for is tank clearance. You want to measure your steering shaft. You want to measure the arm to make sure you replace the shaft with the same shaft coming out of the cart. If you're an expert, you're not even watching this video, so it doesn't even matter. But if you're a do-it-yourself or you're learning the karting stuff or you're learning how to work on your own cart, make sure you get the same shaft that came out of the cart. And make sure these measurements are important. So whether the bolts are on the outside, if they're in the center, how long it is from the center of this shaft, it is all important. So you're going to take measurements. This shaft happened to be 20.5 inches from the bottom of the bolt to the top of the shaft. How do I know? I already measured it. For the most part, most of the European stuff is pretty standard on the diameter of the shaft, but not all shafts will fit into all chassis, so keep that in mind. So again, if when in doubt, measure, measure, measure. We talked about tie rods and inspecting. We talked about why did this shaft bend. You'll notice on this up here, I'm going to hold the wheel with my belly. You're not going to see it. See how loose that is? The wheels are not turning, but we're getting a lot of play out of that bolt. This is not a pinch bolt. So you're not going to be able to tighten that down more and pinch everything down. So it's either this hub is worn out, right here, or the shaft inside, that the hole that bolt goes through is worn out, which is very possible. Now you should be able to snug these up, but it's only a 6mm thread. So you're not going to, put 500 foot-pounds of torque on these bolts. You're going to put 8 to 10 foot-pounds of torque to tighten that. So that's pretty worn out right there. So we're going to keep an eye on that and write that on our notes. Other things to look for. If the front end is bent, then make note of the spindle spacers on both sides. You take a picture, write it in your notebook. You're going to check for up and down play on the bearings. Up and down play on the bearings. So this side feels actually pretty good. So we're good there. You're also going to check for bent Kingpin bolts. This is a Kingpin. This is Kingpin bolt. It goes through the chassis and the spindle. What you're going to do is loosen this nut on the bottom just a little bit. You want to loosen it enough so everything is still firm and not rattling around. You're going to put your lasers on the spindle. If you don't have lasers, you're going to use plates. But right now I'm going to talk about lasers. You're going to put your lasers on. You're going to then spin this bolt 360 degrees multiple times. If your laser is wandering on the other side, your Kingpin bolt is bent. You're going to want to change that. If you're at the track and you're scrambling, it's not pack it up and go home. It's write a note, contact your favorite kart shop on Monday and get the proper parts ordered. But we're in a shop, so we're going to address that issue properly. We're going to replace that Kingpin bolt. Because just imagine if that bolt is bent, it is going to rotate with just normal vibration and turning the wheel, etc. And what's going to happen is that will throw off your alignment. So depending on how it's bent, it could throw off your camber, caster, or both, and we don't want that. So you're going to inspect the Kingpin bolt to make sure that it is not bent. Again, you just gently loosen this nut enough so there's no slop in your spindle assembly. You're going to shoot your laser to the other side. You're going to spin the bolt 360 degrees with an Allen wrench, and you're going to look for your laser. If it runs up and down or side to side, then you know your Kingpin bolt is bent. So you're going to replace that. The other thing you're going to do, there's going to be a nut on the bottom of your steering shaft. And there we go. There's going to be a nut on the bottom. On this particular cart, it's missing the circlip, but usually there's a safety circlip on the bottom as well. So you have a nylock, and then you have a safety circlip nut. Take that circlip off. Otherwise, you'll try to unscrew the nut over the safety clip and make your job a lot longer. What I like to do, depending on what I'm replacing, today I'm replacing the steering shaft and I'm going to check the tie rods. I'm going to check the Heim joints. Assuming all of those are in good shape, when I know I'm replacing the steering shaft. So what I do is I make sure I pull the tie rods off the steering shaft side. I then flip the wheels out of the way. Sometimes if I'm going to maybe accidentally bump them or something, I might run a zip tie on the spindle to the frame just so you don't bounce everything around and all that fun stuff. Then what I like to do is if there's a lot of wires coming off your micron or data acquisition, I remove the micron. If it's only just the one wire like this one, just an RPM lead, I pull the RPM lead off. You're going to have to pull the steering shaft off it, or the steering hub off anyway. So I start here. I remove these two bolts for the hardware. I then remove the steering hub, so I'm just left with the shaft spinning in the cart. Now I notice on this cart there are no collars. So some chassis will have collars on the top and bottom of that steering block. This one doesn't have them. So honestly, I'll probably add them to the cart when I put it back together. But so there's usually collars here. This one, for whatever reason, is missing them. And that's also a setup thing. You can change the spacing of the collars, and it will affect the way that the front end or the cart handles, because this shaft is also going to float inside of this steering column. There's a lot of forces going on here. So back to the steering hub. We're going to take the steering hub and the steering wheel off all with one shot by removing just that bolt. But don't get too lazy and double check all your hardware and make sure it's tight. The reason I do that is what I'm going to do is put a wrench or a screwdriver through the hole that that bolt is in. We're going to have these two bolts removed, and then I'm just going to use the steering shaft as a big screw, and I'm just going to unscrew the whole thing while hanging onto that nut with a wrench. So for me, that's just the way I like to do it. That way you're not sitting there trying to do, a little eighth of a turn on a wrench and then taking it off and moving things around. If it's a different chassis where the nut hangs down lower, sometimes what I will do is leave the steering wheel on, and especially if the shaft's bent really bad, I'll leave the steering shaft or the steering wheel on, and I'll just use the wheel to unturn everything. So that's just one of my little tips. And that's what we do. So those are the things you're going to look for before doing the alignment, before you start pulling stuff apart. You're going to measure, you're going to look, you're going to take pictures, you're going to have the right shaft to replace it with. Again, most of the shafts are 20 mil diameter. That's universal. That's kind of where it stops. The distance from the end of the shaft to this arm is going to change. There's a lot of variables. The length is going to change. How many holes are going to change? Just depends on the brand, the vintage, etc. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, share with a friend, and later on I'll have a whole different video on how to do an alignment. I will do it with lasers and I will do it with plates. So everyone have a great day.